It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when J.D. Vance pulled into the parking lot of Middletown Grocery, his mind preoccupied with the usual congressional matters that filled his days. As he reached for a shopping cart, a familiar figure caught his eye. Mrs. Roberts, his former high school English teacher, counting coins at the self-checkout. He noticed her hands trembling slightly as she sorted through her change, putting some items back when the total exceeded her budget. This wasn't the confident woman who had once commanded respect in classroom 203, who had pushed him to think beyond the confines of his hillbilly upbringing. No, this was someone struggling with a burden he couldn't quite identify. Mrs. Roberts. J.D. approached cautiously, suddenly feeling like a teenager again. She looked up, her eyes momentarily blank, before recognition dawned and her weathered face broke into a warm smile. J.D. Vance, my goodness, look at you. She abandoned her counting to give him a quick hug, the scent of the same drugstore perfume she'd worn for decades, bringing back a flood of memories. Senator now, isn't it? I always knew you'd do something important. J.D. smiled, but couldn't shake the image of her counting those coins, the way she discreetly returned a package of chicken to the cashier with a whispered apology. Something wasn't right. The woman who had changed the trajectory of his life, who had introduced him to literature beyond his small-town expectations, shouldn't be counting pennies for groceries. Their conversation was brief but pleasant, the usual catching up that happens when former students encounter their teachers years later. Mrs. Roberts proudly recounted how she'd followed his career, from his time at Yale Law School to his best-selling memoir and eventual entry into politics. But beneath her cheerful demeanor, J.D. sensed a strain, noticed the slight fray at the edges of her cardigan, the worn-down heels of her sensible shoes. "Are you still teaching?" he asked, helping her load her modest groceries into a canvas bag that had seen better days. "Oh, I retired 3 years ago," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. After 42 years, it was time. Something in her tone suggested the decision hadn't been entirely voluntary. They parted with promises to stay in touch, but as J.D. watched Mrs. Roberts drive away in a 20-year-old sedan with a rusty fender, something gnawed at him. This woman had been instrumental in his journey from a troubled kid in Appalachia to a United States senator. She had stayed after school to help him prepare for college applications, had lent him books from her personal collection, had believed in him when few others did. How could she be struggling now, after a lifetime of service to generations of students like him? That evening, instead of attending a fundraising dinner, J.D. found himself parked outside the address he'd managed to find for Mrs. Roberts. The apartment complex was in a part of town that had seen better days, not dangerous, but certainly not befitting someone who had dedicated her life to education. He sat there, contemplating whether to knock on her door, when he saw her emerge with a small bag of trash. Even from a distance, he could see the weariness in her movements. A quick call to an old classmate who still lived in town confirmed his suspicions. Mrs. Roberts, like many retired teachers in the state, was living primarily on a pension that hadn't kept pace with inflation. Her husband had passed away 5 years earlier, leaving her with medical bills that had consumed most of their savings. The rising cost of rent was forcing her to choose between adequate housing and other necessities. For J.D., it felt personal. This wasn't just about one retired teacher. It was about the woman who had handed him Hillbilly Elegy by his namesake and said, "You should write something like this someday." The woman who had recognized the fire in him and taught him to channel it into words rather than anger. The woman who had told him, "Your circumstances don't define your potential." That night, as he lay awake in his hotel room, J.D. couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Roberts. He thought about his own journey, about the safety nets that had caught him when he'd stumbled, about the opportunities that had been afforded to him because people like Mrs. Roberts had invested in him. And he thought about how society often fails those who dedicate their lives to serving others. By morning, an idea had formed. not just for Mrs. Roberts, but for the thousands of retired teachers like her across the country. It wasn't charity he was considering. It was a recognition of debt, a balancing of scales. Because without Mrs. Roberts steering him toward books instead of troubles, without her quiet insistence that he apply to colleges beyond his perceived reach, without her belief in his potential, there would be no Senator J.D. Vance. He picked up his phone and made 3 calls, one to his chief of staff, one to his financial advisor, and one to a realtor in Middletown. What began as a chance encounter in a grocery store was about to spark something that would change not only Mrs. Roberts' life, but potentially the lives of educators across America. Little did Mrs. Roberts know that as she sipped her morning coffee, carefully rationing the grounds to make them last until her next Social Security check, the wheels were already in motion for a change that would soon leave her and the entire nation astonished. The small 2-bedroom apartment Mrs. Roberts called home was a testament to a life dedicated to others rather than material wealth. Bookshelves lined every available wall space, filled with decades of collected literature, dog-eared classics, contemporary novels, and poetry collections that had inspired generations of students. Framed photographs of graduating classes dating back to the 1980s stood as silent reminders of her legacy, faces of former students who had gone on to become doctors, lawyers, tradespeople, and parents themselves. But beneath this shrine to a fulfilling career, signs of financial strain were evident. The furniture was well worn, the carpet threadbare in high-traffic areas. A stack of bills sat on the kitchen counter, some marked with red final notice stamps. The thermostat was set unnecessarily low despite the autumn chill that permeated the space. Catherine Roberts had never expected to live in luxury on a teacher's pension. She had entered the profession knowing financial abundance wasn't part of the package. But she also hadn't anticipated the health care costs that came with her husband's long illness, or the dramatic increase in housing costs that had swept through even modest neighborhoods like hers. She certainly hadn't expected to be choosing between prescription medications and adequate groceries at 72. Meanwhile, across town, J.D. Vance sat in a coffee shop with a small team of advisors, his laptop open to spreadsheets containing sobering statistics about retired teachers nationwide. The numbers confirmed what his encounter with Mrs. Roberts had suggested. Those who had shaped America's future were often struggling in their golden years. The average teacher pension in this state is just under $30,000 a year, explained his policy director, sliding a document across the table. For someone who retired before 2010, it's even less. And unlike many private sector pensions, teachers' retirement benefits often don't include automatic cost of living adjustments. J.D. nodded, thinking about Mrs. Roberts counting coins at the grocery store. And housing costs in this county have increased by what percentage in the last decade? Nearly 68%, came the reply, while property taxes have similarly risen, putting additional pressure on those with fixed incomes. The statistics painted a grim picture, but for J.D., this wasn't just about numbers. It was about the English teacher who had stayed after school for an hour each Tuesday and Thursday to help him improve his writing. About the woman who had pulled strings to get him into AP classes despite his spotty attendance record. About the mentor who had written him recommendation letters that helped secure scholarships that changed the trajectory of his life. So, what are we looking at for the broader initiative? J.D. asked, turning to his chief of staff. We've drafted legislation that would provide tax credits for retired educators facing housing insecurity, plus an advocacy campaign to press state legislatures to adjust pension calculations for inflation. But that's long-term. It could take years to implement even if we get bipartisan support. J.D. nodded thoughtfully. Policy solutions were essential, but wouldn't help Mrs. Roberts with next month's rent. And the immediate plan for Mrs. Roberts. The realtor he'd contacted entered the conversation. I've found several properties that might work. There's a small community of cottage homes being developed on the edge of town. Aimed at seniors, maintenance included in the homeowners association fees. They're energy efficient, single level, and within 10 minutes of everything she might need. Price point? $245,000 for the model that would best suit a single occupant. JD did some mental calculations. It was significant but manageable within his means. Success had brought financial security he'd never imagined growing up in Middletown. But he knew Mrs. Roberts well enough to know she would never accept such a gift outright. Her pride and independence were defining characteristics, qualities she had instilled in countless students, including himself. "We'll need to structure this carefully," he said finally, "not as charity, but as an investment in someone who has already invested so much in others." As they finalized the details, JD received a text from another former classmate who had reached out to Mrs. Roberts under the pretense of interviewing retired teachers for a community project. The report confirmed his concerns. She was facing a significant rent increase come January, an amount that would consume nearly 70% of her monthly income. She was already exploring options for downsizing to a studio apartment or possibly moving in with her sister in Cincinnati, despite the deep roots she had in the community where she'd taught for 4 decades. The next day, JD arranged to meet Mrs. Roberts for coffee, ostensibly to continue catching up and to ask her advice about educational initiatives he was considering. They met at a local diner where the owner, another former student, insisted on treating them to pie and coffee on the house. "You've left quite a legacy in this town," JD observed, as yet another patron stopped by their booth to greet Mrs. Roberts. She smiled, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Teaching was never just a job for me. These children, you all were my purpose." "You changed trajectories," JD said quietly. "Mine, certainly. I've often wondered how different my life might have been without your influence." Mrs. Roberts waved away the compliment. "You had it in you all along, JD. I just provided some direction." The conversation shifted to current educational challenges, with Mrs. Roberts offering insights from her decades in the classroom. Her passion remained undiminished despite retirement, but when JD carefully steered the conversation toward retirement itself, a shadow crossed her face. "It's been an adjustment," she admitted, "financially more than anything. We planned carefully, Robert and I, but his illness took most of our savings." She quickly changed the subject, unwilling to dwell on her circumstances or to appear as though she was complaining. As they said goodbye, JD watched Mrs. Roberts walk to her car, her posture still teacher straight despite the economic burdens weighing on her shoulders. He thought about the cottage home that would soon be ready for her, about the financial security that was about to replace her constant anxiety, about the dignity that would be restored to a woman who had preserved the dignity of so many others during their vulnerable teenage years. What Mrs. Roberts didn't know was that by this time tomorrow, her life would be transformed by a former student who had never forgotten the teacher who once told him, "Your past is prologue, not prophecy." The third Saturday of every month had long been what Mrs. Roberts called her splurge day, the one day she allowed herself a small luxury within her carefully managed budget. Today's indulgence was a trip to the local bookstore, where she permitted herself to purchase one new paperback, a ritual that maintained her connection to literature now that she no longer had access to the school library. As she browsed the fiction section, running her fingers along the spines of new releases, she was unaware of the activity taking place across town. In the office of Patterson and Wilcox Real Estate, J.D. Vance sat with a small group of people, his financial advisor, the realtor, a lawyer, and 3 others who had been sworn to secrecy. They were putting the final touches on what they had come to call the Roberts Project. "The cottage is purchased and the deed is prepared exactly as we discussed," the lawyer confirmed, sliding a folder across the table. "The trust is established with Mrs. Roberts as the beneficiary. The maintenance fund is set up to cover HOA fees, property taxes, and home insurance for the next 20 years. JD nodded, reviewing the documents. And the moving company? On standby, the realtor replied. They're prepared to handle everything with minimal disruption once she gives consent. JD had wrestled with how to present this gift in a way that Mrs. Roberts could accept. Direct charity would offend her sense of self-sufficiency, but structuring it as an anonymous donation would feel impersonal. In the end, he had decided on honesty wrapped in gratitude, acknowledgement of a debt that could never truly be repaid. What about the others? He asked, turning to his chief of staff. We've identified 53 retired teachers in similar circumstances within the county. The foundation is ready to extend housing assistance to each of them, scaled according to need. The announcement will coincide with the National Policy Initiative next week. JD nodded, satisfied. What had begun as a personal mission to help one teacher had evolved into something far larger, a recognition of the systemic issues facing educators who had devoted their lives to shaping the future only to find themselves economically vulnerable in retirement. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Roberts was surprised by a knock at her apartment door. Opening it, she found JD standing there, a nervous smile on his face and a small gift bag in his hand. JD, this is unexpected, she said, self-consciously glancing behind her at the modest apartment. I would have tidied up if I'd known you were coming. May I come in? There's something important I'd like to discuss with you. Settling in her small living room, surrounded by the books and mementos of a life dedicated to education, JD found himself transported back to classroom discussions about Steinbeck and Fitzgerald. The same woman who had once commanded a room full of rowdy teenagers now sat across from him, curiosity evident in her still sharp eyes. I've been thinking a lot about our conversation, JD began, choosing his words carefully. About the impact you've had, not just on me, but on generations of students who passed through your classroom. Mrs. Roberts smiled modestly. It was my privilege. Society doesn't always value its educators appropriately, JD continued. The people who shape our children, who mold our future citizens and leaders, often struggle for basic security after their teaching days are done. A shadow crossed Mrs. Roberts's face, but she maintained her dignified expression. It's the nature of the profession. We choose it knowing the financial limitations. That doesn't make it right, JD said firmly. You invested in me, in all of us, when we needed guidance most. You gave us tools that helped us build successful lives. Now I'd like to return that investment. He handed her the gift bag. Inside was a small model of a cottage, identical to the one he had purchased for her, along with a key and a folder containing the legal documents. What is this? She asked, confusion evident in her voice. A home, JD said simply. Your home if you want it. No strings attached, no repayments expected. Not charity, Mrs. Roberts. Recognition, acknowledgement of a debt that can never fully be repaid. As he explained the details, the cottage in the new senior-friendly development, the trust established to cover all associated costs, the moving assistance that would make the transition seamless. Tears welled in Mrs. Roberts' eyes. I can't possibly accept this, she whispered, though her hands clutched the model cottage as if it were a lifeline. You once told me something I've never forgotten, JD said gently. You said, sometimes accepting help requires more courage than offering it. You were trying to convince me to apply for scholarships I didn't think I deserved. Mrs. Roberts laughed softly through her tears. Using my own words against me. I learned from the best, JD replied with a smile. This isn't just about you, though. You're the first, but not the last. We're launching a foundation to provide similar assistance to retired teachers across the state, eventually the country. Your situation has illuminated a problem that needs addressing, both through immediate action like this and through policy changes at the state and federal level. He explained the broader initiative, the legislation he was co-sponsoring to improve retirement security for educators, the foundation being established to provide housing assistance to retired teachers facing financial hardship, the awareness campaign to highlight the contributions of educators and the challenges they face in retirement. "You're the inspiration for all of it," he concluded. "Your dedication, your impact, your current circumstances, they've opened my eyes to an injustice that needs correcting." Mrs. Roberts sat in stunned silence, looking from the model cottage to J.D. and back again. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "All those years, all those students, you never know which ones are really listening, which ones will take what you've given them and multiply it beyond anything you could imagine." She reached out and took J.D.'s hand in her own, the same hands that had once marked his essays with encouraging notes in the margins, that had pressed books into his hands with the words, "I think you'll find this one speaks to you. What you're doing, it's more than generous, it's transformative. Not just for me, but potentially for so many others." Outside the window, afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the parking lot of the apartment complex where Mrs. Roberts had been struggling to make rent. Tomorrow, those shadows would fall across her own garden, in her own home, with security that would allow her to live out her remaining years with the dignity she deserved. What had begun as a chance encounter in a grocery store had blossomed into something neither of them could have predicted. A personal act of gratitude that was about to spark a national conversation about how America values its educators, not just during their teaching years, but throughout their lives. 3 months had passed since Mrs. Roberts had moved into her cottage, a transformation that had rippled far beyond her personal circumstances. The small home, with its garden patio and bookshelves built into every available wall space, had become not just a residence, but a symbol of something larger. A rekindling of national appreciation for educators and a growing movement to ensure their dignity in retirement. The day of the moving truck had been captured by a local newspaper reporter who had gotten wind of the story. Despite J.D.'s attempts to keep the gesture private, the image of a U.S. senator helping his former English teacher carry boxes of books into her new home had proven too compelling to remain contained. By nightfall, the story had been picked up by national news outlets. By the end of the week, it had gone viral across social media platforms. "Senator's Act of Gratitude Shines Light on Teacher Pension Crisis," read one headline. "From Classroom to Congress. How one teacher shaped a senator who never forgot," proclaimed another. What might have remained a personal act of gratitude had ignited a national conversation about teacher compensation, pension reform, and the value America places on its educators. Today, J.D. stood on a small stage erected in the community center of the cottage development where Mrs. Roberts now lived. Behind him sat 24 retired teachers, including Mrs. Roberts, each with similar stories of dedication to education, followed by financial precarity in retirement. Before him stood a crowd of journalists, local residents, and former students spanning 4 decades of Middletown's educational history. 3 months ago, I helped my former English teacher move into a new home, J.D. began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. What I thought was a personal debt of gratitude has evolved into something far more significant. A mirror reflecting how we, as a society, value those who shape our future. He gestured to the teachers seated behind him. These educators collectively gave 847 years of service to our community's children. They worked early mornings, late evenings, and weekends. They spent their own money on classroom supplies. They counseled, mentored, and believed in students who sometimes didn't believe in themselves. And yet, despite their decades of service, many found themselves facing housing insecurity and financial anxiety in their retirement years. A murmur of recognition swept through the crowd. This wasn't just Mrs. Roberts' story. It was a narrative repeated in communities across America. Today, I'm proud to announce that every teacher seated behind me is now a homeowner through the Educators Legacy Foundation, JD continued. But this is just the beginning. What started as one small act has blossomed into a national movement. He outlined the progress of the past 90 days. The foundation had secured funding to extend housing assistance to over 500 retired teachers in 12 states. The legislation he had co-sponsored to reform teacher pension systems had gained surprising bipartisan support in Congress. Corporate partners had stepped forward with pledges to match donations and offer financial planning services tailored to educators' unique needs. In the audience, former students of the assembled teachers nodded in approval, many wiping away tears as they recognized the profound impact these individuals had had on their lives. Some held signs. Mrs. Peterson believed in me when no one else did. Mr. Jacobs taught me to love science. Now I'm a researcher. Miss Wilson's class saved my life. Perhaps most significantly, JD continued, we've witnessed an awakening of gratitude across the country. The #sign Thank a Teacher has connected millions of Americans in sharing stories of educators who changed their trajectories. Former students have organized reunions, established scholarships, and found countless ways to say thank you to the teachers who shaped their lives. In the front row, Mrs. Roberts listened with quiet amazement. The woman who had spent decades helping others find their voices had inadvertently become the catalyst for a movement that was finally giving voice to educators' needs and contributions. After the formal announcement, as attendees mingled during the reception, a young reporter approached Mrs. Roberts. "How does it feel to have inspired such a significant national conversation?" she asked, notebook poised. Mrs. Roberts considered the question thoughtfully. "Teaching was never about recognition," she said finally. "It was about potential, seeing it, nurturing it, and then watching it blossom, often years later. What's happening now feels like watching the most magnificent bloom unfold from seeds planted long ago." Across the room, JD was deep in conversation with education policy experts who had traveled from Washington for the announcement. They were discussing the next phase of the initiative, addressing the root causes of teacher compensation inequities and developing sustainable models for educator retirement security. "The cottage homes are a beautiful band-aid," one expert noted, "but we need systemic change." "We'll get there," JD assured her. "Sometimes you need a compelling story to open hearts before you can change minds and policy." As the reception wound down, JD found himself standing with Mrs. Roberts on the patio of the community center, looking out at the row of cottages that had become home to teachers who had shaped generations of Middletown citizens. "I never expected any of this," Mrs. Roberts admitted, gesturing to the scene around them. "When I was counting out change at the grocery store that day, I was just trying to figure out if I could afford both coffee and tea that month." JD nodded. "I never expected it either, but maybe that's how the most meaningful changes happen, not through grand plans, but through moments of recognition, of seeing someone truly." "You were always an observant student," Mrs. Roberts said with a smile, "even when you were pretending not to pay attention." They shared a laugh, teacher and former student now united as partners in an unexpected mission. That evening, after the guests had departed and the community center had grown quiet, Mrs. Roberts walked the short path back to her cottage. Inside, she made herself a cup of tea, not the cheap brand she had been rationing for months, but a quality blend she could now enjoy without worry. She settled into her reading chair, surrounded by the books that had been her companions throughout her teaching career. On the side table lay a leather-bound journal, a gift from JD on moving day. Inside, he had written a simple inscription: "For the teacher who showed me the power of words. May you use these pages to record the next chapter of your story." Mrs. Roberts opened the journal and began to write. She wrote about the unexpected turn her life had taken, about the ripple effects of one moment of recognition in a grocery store, about the conversations now happening in state legislatures and congressional chambers across the country. But mostly, she wrote about gratitude for a career that had allowed her to touch so many lives, for former students who carried her lessons into the world, and for the reminder that even in a society that often undervalues its educators, the seeds of change are always being planted in classroom after classroom, generation after generation. As moonlight filtered through her window, Mrs. Roberts closed the journal, knowing that tomorrow would bring more interviews, more policy discussions, more opportunities to advocate for her fellow educators. The quiet retirement she had envisioned had transformed into something far more purposeful, a final chapter that might prove to be her most impactful teaching moment of all. In homes across America, former students were watching news coverage of the day's announcement, recognizing teachers who had shaped their lives, and perhaps wondering how they too might acknowledge those debts of gratitude. And in Washington, policymakers were beginning to ask long overdue questions about how a nation that claims to value education could allow its educators to struggle in retirement. What had begun with one teacher counting coins had evolved into a national reckoning, proof that no act of recognition is ever truly small when it acknowledges the immeasurable impact of those who dedicate their lives to shaping the future, one student at a time. And there you have it, the incredible true story of how one chance encounter led to a national movement that's changing the lives of teachers across America. If you've ever had a teacher who changed your life, who believed in you when no one else did, who pushed you to become the person you are today, take a moment right now to share your story in the comments below. Who was your Mrs. Roberts? What did they teach you that went beyond textbooks and tests? How did they shape your future? Hit the like button if this story touched your heart, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of extraordinary kindness and impact. Don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss our newest uploads. Remember, sometimes the smallest moments of recognition can spark the biggest changes. Who will you thank today?